Hey there, John Morris here, johnmorrisonline.com. This lesson, we're going to get into the different tools, kind of the base tools that you would need in order to start working with code, in particular PHP. So there's three kind of main standard ones that you may have heard of before. And then there's a fourth one, which is kind of the latest and greatest. So we're going to talk about what all these different things are and how they all kind of work together, and then what you actually need in order to get going. So now, one of the things here is this stuff changes in the time that I've been doing this coding thing. There's been all sorts of different products and brands come and go. And so I'm a little reluctant to tell you go download and install this one in particular, or that one, or to get into doing maybe tutorials on exactly how to install all of these, because there's so many out there. And again, they come and go. I really want to give you something that no matter what's out there at any given time, you can kind of get your head around what it is that you need. So I will show you some examples, but I want to kind of really talk about the bigger picture here. So the first thing that you need is, as you see here, some sort of code editor. So the code editor, you could think of, it could be as simple as something like Notepad. I hate to say this, but when I very first started coding, I started out in Notepad. And you can technically use Notepad, but it is about the hardest way in the world for you to go about coding. So I don't recommend that, but you just need something that you can write plain text in that's not going to add any, because something like Microsoft Word or even WordPad, it formats the text, and so it's going to add HTML and different things to the actual code that you write in it. So using those sorts of things isn't going to work. It's going to have a lot of extra stuff in there. Even Notepad, I think there's, if I remember right, it's been so long, but there's certain things that it can potentially add to a file that you have to watch out for. So you really want something that's designed to write code in, because it's not only going to make sure none of that happens, but it's also going to give you syntax highlighting. So it's going to actually highlight the code that you write in a certain way so that you can tell kind of what's what, the difference between, say, a variable and a function, plain text, and it helps you to spot problems a little bit easier, and just makes it easier to code in. So you want to start with some sort of code editor, and that's basically what you write your code in. Now, there are a number of these. We'll click over. One of the more popular, and the one I first started out with, and probably I might say the most basic of the ones out there, is Notepad++. So it essentially takes the idea of Notepad and it turns it into a code editor. And so this one is just fine. It gives you syntax highlighting, has some other good stuff in there, but it works just fine. It's a more basic one. Probably a really popular one is called Sublime Text. So this is one that when I talk to people, I hear a lot of people running. It does cost, and I'm not exactly so it's $80 here. You can download it for free, but it's got some sort of licensing on it. I haven't actually used Sublime Text, so I don't know exactly how all of it works. But this is a really popular one that you probably hear people talk about that's out there as well. And then another one that has come out is called Atom, and I believe this is made by GitHub, or the people that make GitHub, if I remember correctly. Yep. Made with love by GitHub. So this is a really popular one that's out there as well. It's really pretty looking. So that's another one that you could use. So Notepad++, Sublime Text, Atom, Brackets is one that has come out recently. There's all sorts of them. If you just Google, code editor or something along those lines, you're going to see a whole list of a bunch of different ones. And it's really just my advice when it comes to that picking a code editor is you're going to be spending a lot of time in your code editor. It's really going to be the thing that you interact with the most. So try a couple different ones and see what feels most comfortable to you. It's more important. It's not really about what's the best editor. They all do lots of different things and do a lot of similar things. It's more about what you're comfortable with, what works in the way that you feel good about. and then you're not overwhelmed by. And so it might be that you start off with Notepad++, and then you move into something like Atom or Sublime Text or Brackets or something later on as you get a little more familiar with code. But focus on what feels the most comfortable for you, because it's something you're going to be spending a lot of time in. All right, next is your local server. Okay, so this is probably the one where people get caught up a little bit more, because this is an immediately obvious. Now, a code editor kind of makes sense. Most people get that they're going to need that sort of thing. But then let's say, for example, you're running PHP code, and you try to open a PHP file that you've coded in your web browser. You're going to notice that you're just going to see the PHP code. It's not actually going to process that code. Okay, it's not going to run the code or run the script. And that's because PHP is really you can think about as software. It's really a piece of software that's meant to run on a particular kind of computer. So you have a computer that's meant to be a web server. And so with that web server has another piece of software on it that is actually that computer has another piece of software on it that is the web server. So Apache might be something that you've familiar with, or IIS for Windows might be something that you're familiar with. So those are actually web server softwares, and what they do is essentially, when there's a request for a web page made to the computer, it's that web server software that ultimately handles it and determines whether something needs to be processed by PHP or not, and kind of handles all of that back and forth. You don't have that by default installed on your regular computer. Okay, so you need something on your computer to emulate that sort of environment. And that's what these local servers, these local web server softwares do. They let you emulate a web server and be able to run PHP files and all this sort of thing in your browser. Okay, so this is something that you pretty much, once you get outside of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, you need a local server like this. For PHP and interact with MySQL and any sort of server-side script, you need something that can emulate this for you. So there's a number of them out there. Again, I'll cover a couple of the probably more popular ones, or the ones that I know, and then you can decide. So the first one is what's called MAMP. And so that's Macintosh, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And so essentially what this is going to, well, actually now I guess it used to be just for Mac. I hadn't noticed this, but now it runs on Windows as well. That's why they changed this to my Apache. That's interesting. So anyway, what this does is it simulates that environment for you. So it's going, when you install this, it's basically going to install all the things that you need. Apache, MySQL, PHP. It's going to install them and set them all up so that you can start writing code and viewing web pages and interacting with the MySQL database and all that sort of thing on your local computer. Okay, so that's what MAMP does. This, again, like I said, was originally designed for Mac, which is why I put this on here, but now it actually does run on Windows as well. You also have XAMPP. So XAMPP was kind of the sister product to MAMP. So originally MAMP was just for Macintosh, and then they came out, I believe they actually even ported MAMP to be able to be used on Windows, and that's what XAMPP was. Now you can see both of these both run on Windows and Mac now. So you can kind of, no matter what you're running, you can decide what you want to use, but it does the same thing. So it's a development environment. It helps create the web server and install MySQL and PHP and all the stuff you need so that you can actually run your scripts. Another one that I've never used is Desktop Server, but this is one that I've heard of before and people talk about. So it's another one that you can use out there. And then one that I used quite a bit is WAMP Server in the past. This is probably the one I used the most, just because it seemed to work a little bit better on Windows than XAMPP did. Now, I haven't used XAMPP in a really long time, so that all could be totally different now. But this, again, does the same thing. It sets up your environment so that you can run your scripts, Apache, PHP, MySQL, all that sort of thing. All right, so those are some different kind of local servers that are out there. Now, the next category that we have is what's called an IDE. So that stands for Integrated Development Environment. And essentially what it does is it takes this idea of the code editor, the local service, and then usually wraps in some other things that might be useful for someone who's working on code, and it puts it all into one. So essentially you can install this piece of software, and you're going to have the code editor, you're going to have the local server, and it's all going to be kind of integrated in a way where you don't have to mess with the files on the back end. It's all kind of set up to work together. Okay, so if you're looking for kind of a one-stop shop, then this an IDE might be the way to go. Now, you might be wondering, well, why would anybody use a code editor versus a local server? It goes back to what I said with the code editor. A lot of people, as they use a code editor, they really kind of get attached to them, and so they really don't want to switch to the code editor that comes in an IDE. I would say that's probably the biggest reason why a lot of this stuff still exists. So again, for you, you'll just have to figure that out. But if you want a one-stop shop, that's what an IDE is. All right, so we're going to talk about a few out there. So one of them, probably a more enterprise solution, is Visual Studio. I messed with this at once. It has a lot of stuff in it, so it was a little overwhelming for me. I first tried it when I was first starting out in coding. It was really a little overwhelming for me to use at that point, but I still see people use it. My suggestion is if you're going to stick to more web type stuff, this might be a little bit of overkill. But if you ever see yourself getting into doing like, C++ or C# or those sorts of things, then this might be a good editor for you, because I haven't used it a ton, but my sense of it is this is a little bit better for those types of software, and maybe a little bit overkill for the web stuff. But again, it'll run all of that stuff, and you can see it's got the code editor. You can look at your different files and all that sort of thing. Another one, this one I used for a long time, is NetBeans, and they do have, at least at one point, they had a PHP specific version. Let's go ahead and click this download here. Yeah, so they do have NetBeans for PHP. That's what this one is right here. So you can see they have Java and Groovy and all this other stuff here. But you can download just the PHP one to your computer, and it'll install just what you need in order to run and work with PHP. So they have that option as well. They also have other flavors with C++ and C and all that sort of thing. So I used this for a long time, and it has a lot of cool things, like you can connect to GitHub or a Subversion server. It's got all the syntax hiding you expect. It's got code completion, so as you're typing your code, it'll give you suggestions for different functions you might be able to that you might be trying to type, and all that sort of thing. It's got a tree where you can click on a class and look at a class. You can search for, without having to actually go to the code file, you can search for different things. It really is. I mean, it's a pretty good IDE in my opinion. Again, I used it for a lot of years. Probably the biggest thing is it is a little bit heavy, and it does take up a decent amount of resources, and at times can run a little slow. It has been a while since I used it, so they may have got some of that cleaned up, but that was what I noticed, and ultimately one of the reasons why I switched off it. We're going to talk about what I use here in just a second. But that's another example. Eclipse is a popular one that I've heard of. I've never used, but you can see here, again, it's got the code editor in here. It's got your file system. It's kind of all just meant to go together. It has the emulator and all that sort of thing. So then you have Xcode. Xcode is really meant for if you're getting into building, the iOS apps. So this isn't necessarily something used for web stuff, but I wanted to throw it in here just in case you get into building that sort of thing. All right, so now let's talk about the last piece here, which is my question marks. And one could maybe argue the latest and greatest I'm really liking, and that is what's called a cloud IDE. So it's the same concept as an IDE, but instead of it being a piece of software that you download to your site, it's actually, some of them can have software that you download, but the whole idea is that all of your files are actually hosted in the cloud. And so you can access it through a web browser. So let me just go to my dashboard and sign in here. And you can see I have this back end here where I can get into, you can spin up basically different workspaces. And if you create a new workspace, right, you can make it for PHP. If you're doing Python stuff, you can do Ruby. You can have a specific WordPress workspace built, C++, and they all have sort of different things that they support, but it allows you to really quickly create that sort of thing. So it's really handy. And the nice thing about it is I can be on my desktop, I can go over to my laptop, I can even go on my phone, and when I log in to use it, it's all the same code, right? Which is different from if you have a code editor installed on your laptop, then all the code that you write in that code editor is saved locally. So if you go over to your desktop, well, it's not necessarily synced up there. Whereas with this, it is. And that's why I like it, because I do work on a number of different devices. At times, I'm traveling a decent amount. And so having access to the exact same code is really nice. Now, some of these are limited in the sense that, for example, with this, I think you can connect to GitHub, but you can't connect to, say, Subversion. There's another option besides Cloud9 with Code Anywhere. I think you can connect to some more of that stuff with this one. I tried this one at first and didn't really like it, and then I've been using Cloud9 a while, and this one has, I think, done a lot of development, so I may check this back out again at some point. But ultimately, again, the whole idea, and there will probably be others that pop up and so forth. I was using Nitrous actually for a while, and Nitrous actually went under. And so that's when I switched to Cloud9. So again, all of these pieces of software that I've showed you, they could come, they could go. At one point could be good, at one point could be bad, and then be good again. I have no idea where that whole marketplace and all of this is going. But what I want you to know is the difference between a code editor, a web server, an IDE, and a cloud IDE. So if you're not going the IDE route, you need both the code editor and the local server, the local web server. If you go the IDE route, whether it's a cloud or just a regular IDE, all of that is built into one. So that's what I want you to get out of this. From there, just go out and do some research, play with different ones. When I first started doing all this, I downloaded 3 or 4 at once, and I would check them out and see what I liked, and that's how I ended up settling on what I settled on. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better insight into what's all out there, what you're going to need in order to get up and running, and some of the different software that's out there for you to use. All right, that'll do it for this lesson. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.